All right, everybody, in this section we're learning more details about the plasma membrane and in particular how substances cross the membrane, which is really important because that's how cells get their nutrients in and it's how they get their wastes out. So we're focusing on diffusion in this section. So the key learning intention is that the plasma membrane controls the entry and exit of substances, which we know that's the main function of the plasma membrane, and it's selectively permeable, and we'll learn more about what that means. So you need to be able to explain the process of diffusion and describe how cells use simple diffusion and facilitated diffusion to transport substances. This is a reminder from our last lesson where plasma membranes have four main functions. So we're focusing on the fact that plasma membranes are a selective boundary. They control what passes, just like the border of a country. And they transport materials across that border and across that boundary. That's our main focus for today. So before we jump into any detail, we need to talk about this process called diffusion, which is a bit of chemistry. Diffusion is just the movement of a substance that's dissolved in something else. And when we talk about something dissolved, we mean the solute. The solute dissolves in the solvent. So it's the movement of the solute from an area of high concentration to low concentration. You can see in the video here that if we start off with a whole lot of red particles that are dissolved in this black liquid here, they start off all in the one place, which is an area of high concentration in this region here. And then because of the random movement of all the particles, because of particle theory, all particles are constantly moving, those solute particles that are dissolved gradually spread themselves out and they move from that high region of concentration to all the other regions that had low concentration. So essentially diffusion is spreading out. Diffusion can happen in liquids and in gases because the particles can move freely in both of those materials. And when we say something's diffusing from high to low, we say it's diffusing down its concentration gradient. That just means from an area of high to low concentration. Solutes and solvents can diffuse. So I mentioned solutes here. We will learn about how water can diffuse. That's called osmosis, and we'll learn that next lesson. So this process is key for how materials get into and out of cells. And if we have a look at this final diagram here, before diffusion, we've got an area of high concentration of solute, and once it's spread out, those particles have diffused and they're spread into regions of low concentration. Here's a whole lot of examples of diffusion in everyday life. Perfume, if you've got these little diffusers, they're literally called diffusers because the perfume travels up the little bamboo sticks, or sometimes they're plastic or ceramic, and then they diffuse out into the air and gradually spread out into the room, so you've got perfume in the room. Or you tea drinkers, you're using diffusion every time you put a tea bag into water because the particles of the tea flavouring spread out from the leaves where they're high concentration out into the water where there's low. We've also got air pollution, diffusing out from the factory into the country around it. And back to some more biology. In our lungs, these are the alveoli in our lungs, the little air pockets. Whenever we breathe in oxygen, our red blood cells come through our blood vessels. The oxygen diffuses into the red blood cells because there's low concentration of oxygen in there, and the carbon dioxide diffuses out into the alveolus where there's low concentration of carbon dioxide. So back to the plasma membrane. It's selectively permeable, which means it can control which substances go in and out. All our little cells, like this guy, we need to control what goes in. We can't just let anything go in and anything go out. So we need that barrier to be selectively permeable. And importantly, the permeability depends on the properties of the material. So some materials can cross and some of them can't. And let's learn about which molecules and materials can cross and which ones can't now. So this is the main property that controls whether something can cross the cell membrane or the plasma membrane. It's whether a molecule is polar or non-polar. A little bit more chemistry. So polar molecules, we don't need to learn too much chemistry, but they're polar because they're asymmetrical. So this is a water molecule down here. You can see the structure of it. Water is H2O, there's two H's and an O, and the shape of that water molecule is not symmetrical. And that causes it to be able to form bonds with other molecules. So polar molecules can form bonds with other polar molecules, and they can also form bonds with water. So polar molecules are called hydrophilic, water-loving. Obviously water is polar, and another example is urea, the waste product we produce and we need to get rid of it in our urine. The opposite of polar molecules are non-polar molecules. They're symmetrical. And because they're symmetrical, they don't bond easily to water. So they're hydrophobic and they repel water molecules. Common non-polar molecules are lipids, like fats and oils. Oxygen and carbon dioxide are also really common non-polar molecules. And here's carbon dioxide down here, which is CO2. Water was H2O. And you can see the structure of a carbon dioxide molecule here. It's symmetrical, it's even along each side. And that causes it to not bond easily to water. So, now when we look at a cell membrane, it's easier to categorize which molecules can get in and out because of the key properties of the phospholipid bilayer, which we learnt last lesson. So remember, the interior part of the bilayer, that's where the hydrophobic ends of the phospholipids are, because they arrange themselves pointing away from the water molecules, so they're not touching the water molecules. So that means to cross a cell membrane, you also need to be hydrophobic if you're a molecule to be able to get through. So that means the first category of molecules that can easily pass the cell membrane, they're those hydrophobic molecules, which are small and non-polar. So oxygen and carbon dioxide, they can easily get in and out of our cells just by diffusing through. Polar molecules, they include water and urea, like we mentioned before. They're hydrophilic, so they prefer to bond to water. But their bonds to water aren't really, really strong. So they can occasionally, and to a small extent, still cross the membrane. But many of them will still just bounce off and stay in or outside the cell, wherever they started from. And then the category of molecules that can't cross the cell membrane at all are charged molecules and ions. So here is Na+. If you remember some chemistry, this is a sodium ion. And ions have a charge. They're just an atom that's gained or lost electrons. And here's an amino acid, really important biological molecule. You can see at this end it's got a positive charge, and this end it has a negative charge. So because of that charge, it's extremely hydrophilic. It's attracted to water, and it can't get through that hydrophobic layer in the middle. So all these charged particles are going to bounce off and not get through. All right, so we can categorize how materials move through cells, because cells have evolved two main ways to get things in and out. And a third way, osmosis, which is for water, and we'll learn that later. So when materials go in and out of a cell, we're focusing on passive transport for today. So passive means those molecules diffuse in or out of the cell without there needing to be energy used. Passive means it just happens naturally or spontaneously. So simple diffusion, facilitated diffusion, and osmosis are the three types of passive transport. Simple diffusion is the first one, and it's literally the molecules diffusing from one side of the cell membrane to the other. So it's just like diffusion. They start off in an area of high concentration, and if there's an area of low concentration inside the cell, those molecules or particles will naturally diffuse across the cell membrane into the cell, as long as they can cross the membrane. So simple diffusion only works for small non-polar molecules and occasionally polar molecules, as we learned before. Even after diffusion's finished, like it looks like this video is finished, we actually reach what's called a dynamic equilibrium, which means the molecules and the particles are still moving. So actually, we should be seeing some of these particles still moving from left to right, but some of the other ones are moving from right to left. So there's still an even number on each side. Or even on each side, but the particles are still moving. Okay, the other type of passive transport, because some molecules can't cross the cell membrane, as we've learnt, is called facilitated diffusion. So cells have evolved to have these proteins embedded in the cell membrane that are called channel proteins or carrier proteins. And these are basically just ways for those larger polar and charged molecules to easily diffuse through the membrane. So the first one here is a channel protein. All it is one of those special proteins combined into the cell membrane. And it's basically an open channel where certain molecules can pass through. And they're usually evolved to just allow one molecule, one type of molecule to diffuse through them. So this might be something like glucose. Now those glucose molecules can diffuse in through the cell. This one here is a carrier protein. Carrier proteins aren't like an open channel, they move more like a seesaw. So they open on one side, they allow some of the molecules to come in, and then they change shape and they swing around to the other side and basically open up at the bottom. And then those molecules can diffuse out into the cell and into the cytosol. So both of these are just allowing diffusion to happen for those molecules that can't normally get through. So it's for those substances that can't readily cross, like polar and charged molecules. Okay, so those are the types of passive transport, and we'll learn about osmosis, which is the third type of passive next lesson.